All right. Well, thank you everyone for having me once again. My name is AJ Reyes. I'm an aquatic ecologist and certified lake manager working with GEI Consultants. I have been lucky enough to be your lake manager since I believe 2019. So I've been on Roaring Brook Lake working there for many, many years. Most of you know this already, but I grew up in the town of Putnam Valley. I grew up on North Shore Road up in Lake Oscawana area. So I'm very familiar with the town, very familiar with the lake. So today I wanted to give you an annual update on the lake, what's been going on there. So we're going to start with just a summary of water quality. I'm going to give a very brief overview on water quality, kind of walk through some of the different things that we look at, the indicators to tell us is the lake good to swim in, good to fish in, good for general use. And then I'm going to jump into our aquatic plants, which have become a lot more of a relevant issue in the last few years, talk about where we've sort of been there. And then I want to end the talk by tying it all together to sort of give a bird's eye view of what's been happening in the ecosystem. Spoiler alert, but Roaring Brook Lake has been undergoing a lot of different significant changes over these past few years in the lake ecosystem that the lake has not seen since pre-grass carp back in 2011. So I wanted to sort of contextualize all of that for you and see how that moves forward. And then I will end the talk with some just general watershed, individual homeowner best practices to keep things going. So, as you know, Roaring Brook Lake is monitored for water quality in two major ways. We do monitoring ourselves, and then also the Citizens Statewide Lakes Assessment Program, the volunteers, all of you that collect data. And between both of those sources of data, Roaring Brook Lake has an excellent record of water quality going back to 2009. So CSLAP started in 2009, and then we started doing consistent sampling in 2019 to augment that with our own analyses. And what that allows us to do is get a great picture of the water quality of the lake. And you can think of water quality as sort of a summation of indicators that tell us how we are able to use the water body, either by swimming, fishing, boating, just general recreation and aesthetics. Everybody uses the water body for a different potential reason. Some people like to look at it, some people like to swim in it, some people like to fish in it, some people just, like it as a backdrop when they wake up in the morning and have their coffee. There's no wrong use of the lake, and water quality is our direct indicator. So I'm going to be talking about a few different parameters that we look at that tell us how sort of healthy a water body is. Now, I don't like the word health for lakes, and I can talk about why I don't like that, but for what we're talking about, I'll keep using the word health. So we collect all these different parameters, and what we try to do is we try to shrink them down into a succinct scoring criteria that's able to quickly communicate how well the water body is doing. So if you've looked at our past reports, we have these items called scorecards where we basically take each parameter and we rank them on a score from 1 to 3, well, it was really 0 to 3. And if you get a higher amount of points, that means that parameter is more suited towards the maximum amount of use. So for example, we have optimal values for these different parameters, we have threshold values, and then we also look at the long-term range. So we look at water clarity, which is how far down you can see in the water, which is a surrogate for how much algae and material is in the water, right? If the water is clearer, then there's less stuff that's in the water, and in most northeastern lakes, that stuff is algae and potentially harmful algae. Phosphorus and nitrogen are key nutrients that drive algae growth. Algae love both phosphorus and nitrogen and use it, so we track those concentrations as well. And then chlorophyll A, which is the main pigment inside of the algae. So the chlorophyll A is a indicator for algae biomass. If you have more chlorophyll A, you have more algae biomass. So when we take all the data we've collected, we have this very clear scorecard here that we rank our parameters by. So if you're in the green, you have an excellent score for an individual parameter. Let's say your water clarity is excellent throughout the entire year, meaning that it is probably the best you can possibly hope that it could be. And then thinking about it, if you go all the way to the poor side of the scoring criteria, that is where it's the worst it could possibly be. So you're thinking about an optimal condition and a significantly stressed condition. Just to kind of picture this, you can think of an optimal condition as like a beautiful, pristine Adirondack lake. Think about Lake George, think about Lake Tahoe, these lakes that are beautiful, basically untouched by humans. And then on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you have your lakes that are have significant harmful algae blooms throughout the entire season, this sort of green pea soupy water. So you can think about it on that sort of the gradation. So we wanted to rank Roaring Brook within that gradation to see where things are. But we also wanted to make sure it was realistic to what we think Roaring Brook could actually achieve, because Roaring Brook Lake is not Lake George. It is not Lake Tahoe. It is its own system. So we're trying to do a few different things here, but we've basically boiled this down to a quick little scorecard. And basically, for this year, Roaring Brook came out as pretty good, I would say. Every single parameter scored at least 2 out of 3 in our scoring criteria. So what does that actually mean? That means that every parameter basically was not at its threshold level, so it wasn't really, really bad, but nothing was sort of at its optimal level. And I have some graphs that will talk about what that actually means. So take-home message is that this is pretty good, and this is basically in line with what we've been seeing on Roaring Brook Lake. Water clarity, total phosphorus, total nitrogen, and chlorophyll A have all been low enough to support all different uses, even if it hasn't been as low as it could possibly be, which is a good thing, right? That means that we can still use the lake even in all of its different uses, and there's not really a major impediment happening, at least in the water quality. Doesn't mean we don't have a place to go and a place to strive for potentially, but it's a good sign overall. So, water clarity. I mentioned water clarity before. Water clarity is how far down you can see into the water. As I mentioned before, the more material that's in the water, the less water clarity you have, and that material is mostly algae. And I'm going to show a few of these graphs here, so I'll just orient you to these graphs. Basically, this is all of the data that both you've collected and then GEI and when I was at my previous company, NEAR, we collected together. And this is what we call a time series. So we're looking at every single year, the average value of the parameter each year throughout time. So I wouldn't worry about all the different individual variation. What was important is this 2025 number here, over on the right-hand side. And our clarity has been getting better and better over time over the last few years and is really close to getting to that optimal number. So we were almost about to score a whole 3 out of 3 on this, which would have been excellent. But this is a great sign, and I think this is what's been consistently the lake users have been seeing. The clarity in the lake has been very good. There have been many times where the clarity has been over 3 meters, which is a really good sign for the lake throughout the season. So while it's technically scored as good, this is probably the closest we have to the optimal value, which is excellent. Total phosphorus, the same, a similar story, really good total phosphorus. Not the best we can possibly have, and there's still a risk for potential algae blooms here or there, and sometimes that will still happen on Roaring Brook Lake. But really, we don't have a ton of phosphorus in the lake right now that's consistently driving bad algae conditions. You know, if you compare this to other lakes in the area, you know, Lake Mohegan, Lake Peekskill, Putnam Lake, Lake Carmel, that have much, much higher phosphorus, Roaring Brook Lake basically is half the amount of phosphorus that these lakes have, or even more in general. So once again, this is a really good sign. While we've had some up and downs, especially in the most recent years, 2025 was very consistent, which is good. You want to see consistent water quality. You don't want to see this bouncing up and down. So once again, another good sign with phosphorus. Chlorophyll A, as I mentioned before, this is your surrogate for algae. As chlorophyll A increases, algae increases as well. And as you can see, we've had some really low numbers, and they've also been relatively consistent in 2025. 2025 was actually, I believe, the second best year for chlorophyll A concentration since we've started sampling. So once again, really low concentration of algae in the water. And then total nitrogen, while we had, maybe a slight uptick from 2024, it's been relatively consistent and relatively low. You know, in past years, we've spoken about how we think that the reason why the nitrogen's been a little bit lower in the last few years, and also has been very consistent in terms of it hasn't varied a lot, is partially because of this work that's been done on the septic systems. The increased pump outs from septic systems, the first nutrient that would be affected by managing the septic systems in a more responsible way is nitrogen, because nitrogen moves through the soil faster than phosphorus does. So we've seen something similar to this on Lake Oscawana, but we believe that since about that 2016 timeframe, when there was a lot more onus on pumping out and inspecting systems, we think it's had a slight marginally positive effect. I don't want to say it's changed everything, and there's still a lot of work to be done. However, we do think we're seeing some sort of a positive effect on the lakes through at least the pumping out and inspecting, which isn't everything, and I'll talk more about the additional steps we need to take, but generally it's a good sign. So water quality has been good. We've had good water clarity measurements. The nutrients have been relatively low. The algae has been relatively low as well. So all's been really, really good on water quality. I wanted to talk a little bit about something we haven't spoken about in a few years, and this is going to tie into the sort of larger ecosystem changes that I've been talking about. But every few years, we do monitor something called zooplankton. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if anyone in this group has never really heard of what a zooplankton is. But zooplankton are these small little creatures that exist all throughout Roaring Brook Lake of all various sizes. They kind of look like aliens. They look like something that, if you found in like a science fiction cheesy movie from the 60s, they would be there. But they're incredibly important to lake ecosystems. They are an important link. They link the algae production to the fish production. So young fish really depend on the zooplankton for an early life stage for food. It's incredibly important also because especially these large ones, so this picture I have here is called a Daphnia. These plankton can actually filter out the water, and they eat a ton of algae, and they can actually be responsible for increases in water clarity. So they actually might have a actual positive benefit on the way the lake looks. So this isn't just some critter that's there and it's in the lake and it's a nice little feature. Their populations have a meaningful impact on what goes on in the lake. And what we always want to see is a high abundance of these large-bodied zooplankton. The larger ones are the ones that filter out more algae and they make the water clearer. So the take-home message here is we want these. We want as many large ones as possible. And we've been tracking this over time. Unfortunately, what we've seen is while the data is a little bit variable, we've seen a decline in the abundance, especially from 2020 to 2024 and 25. 2019 and 25 are somewhat similar, but in these cladoceran and copepod, these ones are up there on the two ones, the top two sections. Those are your big important zooplankton, and we've started to see a decline in their abundance. We've also seen a decline in their size. So what this basically is this is called a box and whisker plot. But for very, very simple interpretation, you can see that the average body length, which is on the y-axis, that has been steadily declining over time. So what's happening is that we're getting less zooplankton in the lake, and the zooplankton that we have are much, much smaller than what we would normally want to see. And ideally, what you would like to have, and I don't have it marked up here, you want to see the average zooplankton size be around 0.6 millimeters, so a little bit below that 0.8. And as you can see, we are definitely below that number. Now, keep that in the back of your minds. It's going to all make sense when I come back to it after we talk about the plants, but we have to talk about the plants before it all sort of makes sense. I promise I will wrap this all up together. So, the aquatic plant survey. So in recent years, we've had an increase in aquatic plants in the lake, most likely because the grass carp, after that 2023 rainstorm, the grass carp were already declining in the lake, but the 2023 rainstorm in July, which pushed all those grass carp over the dam, likely caused a lot of mortality in grass carp, both with the immediately going over the dam and then also long term. And while the carp were declining in the lake anyway, this sort of jump-started that process. So after 2023, in a significant way, we started to see increases in vegetation all throughout the lake, especially in the North Basin, down by Moon Beach, all across the perimeter of the water body. So we started doing more aquatic plant surveys in more recent years to be able to try to quantify what was going on. That's why, if you notice, we did one survey initially when we started, and then we took a few years off because we didn't know, the carp, the vegetation was very low and it wasn't really a major management concern, so we shifted our focus to other things, items in the watershed, different fishery surveys. But because we started to see this increase again, we wanted to kind of ramp up our monitoring of the actual plants because they were going to be a really large pending issue. And I know you've heard me talk about this for many, many years, even before the plants started to come up, that this is an issue we're going to have to address because the lake has never really had to deal with aquatic plant issues for over a decade. in any real serious way, because the grass carp have been able to take care of all the plants in the lake, and it's never been a concern. So it's something that we've been sort of ramping up our monitoring on. So what have we seen in general? Generally, we haven't seen an increase in just total aquatic plant coverage throughout the lake. This is a simple heat map. Any color that's blue or light green is very light plant coverage. Anything that is red is much, much higher plant coverage. So you can see from 2022 to 24, we had an increase in just total plant coverage throughout the lake. And then we also, in 2025, while it seemed to decline a little bit from 24, what you notice is that there's a lot more green in a lot of areas of the lake, and especially in the middle of the lake. So while we didn't see the same amount of like maybe total density in like the North Basin in some areas, we did see the plants spreading to deeper sections that we normally didn't see. And you can see that by looking at some sonar images. So this is a fish finder that we have on the boat when we're doing the survey. And as all these strands that are sticking up are all aquatic plants. And on the very right, you can see the depth, and that's in feet. So we could start to see plants growing in 8 to 10 feet, even deeper water. And we usually do not see that in Roaring Brook Lake, especially before the grass carp sort of died off and their numbers declined. So we still have plant problem. We still have abundant plants throughout the lake, but they're starting to inhabit some deeper areas. Now, they're not really abundant in these deeper areas. I don't want to say that there's these crazy underwater forests in like 12 feet of water, but we are seeing that sort of expansion, and it makes sense. We have great water clarity, and what great water clarity means is that more light can penetrate down to the bottom. So if you have 3 meters of clarity, which is about 10 feet, plants can grow in water that's a little bit deeper than that. So now you're thinking 12 feet, and now if there's no grass carp that are able to control them, it would make sense that you start to see more plants in deeper water. Some other just general numbers here. This is mean percent coverage, so how thick are the plants at a particular point. And while this graph is really small, I'll just tell you that the blue and the purple lines here, the ones that are sort of off to the right of each of these different species, for most species in the lake, they're starting to increase. So most species are becoming more dense over time between 2019, 2022, 24, and 25. Once again, corroborating the story that we're getting more plants and they're becoming denser. We also have more species in the lake in general. So once the grass carp predation has sort of fallen off, all these seeds that were in all these different areas of species that weren't present for years and years now have all sprouted, and we're starting to see a lot more different species in the lake than we saw before. I wanted to also include this. This is a metric we call growth form, and very simply, this is how high the plants are growing in the water column. And this is incredibly important for recreation, because most lake users wouldn't care less about aquatic plants if they weren't seeing them. And growth form directly measures how much you're seeing the plants. So when you look at this graph, think about this 5 number as the top of the surface of the water, and then the bottom of the graph being like the sediment, right? So what we're seeing, and especially with Eurasian water milfoil, is the growth form is increasing through time. So it's not just that the plants are getting denser, is that some of the plants are actually getting closer to the surface of the water, which is what creates our issues with recreation. When you're swimming, right, if you're swimming through the North Basin, you necessarily don't care if there's plants that are growing 2 feet off of the bottom. That's not impacting you at all. But if those plants are 6 inches under the surface and your feet start to get tangled, or let's say you're in a boat and you have an electric trolling motor and you get caught in some weeds and you have to constantly start clearing off your motor to be able to use it, once again, you're not going to care if the plants are 6 inches off the bottom, but you're going to care if they're almost to the surface. So that's why this is incredibly important for us to look at over time. So the plants are increasing in Roaring Brook Lake. They are growing to deeper depths. They are generally becoming more abundant and dense at the areas, and also some species are coming a little bit closer to the surface of the water, which is what you would expect when you have this decline in grass carp. So really, the story from 2025 isn't that much different than 2024. We've known we're having this increase, and we know we have to think about potentially doing something about it in the future. Partially, I believe that because I don't know if the aquatic plant population is going to necessarily level off. And we don't know when that level off point is going to come, right? There's still areas for plants to grow, both in deeper water, both by Moon Beach, the Moon Beach area, both in the North Basin as well. So we don't really know the point at which it's going to reach its maximum. And the question is that maximum going to drastically change the way you use the water body? And that's why we need to keep thinking about them. So, moving slightly towards the ecosystem impacts that I wanted to talk about. Here, I put together a sort of comprehensive timeline of aquatic plant abundance and management on Roaring Brook Lake since 2011. And I use 2011 as sort of the grass carp stocking time frame. And what I'm hoping to do with this is just kind of give you an idea of sort of where we've been and where we're coming and how all of these different factors influence what we're seeing. So back in 2011, there was 500 grass carp stocked into the lake, and basically between 2011 to 2023, outside of a few years here or there, like the 2016 bladderwort explosion that happened, plants have been relatively low in the lake. They really have not been a major recreational issue. The drawdown helps this in the really, really shallow areas to keep plants from being a recreational issue. And for most of this time, the carp feeding was well outpacing the plant production, which is how you get no plants in the lake. If carp are eating the plants faster than the plants can grow, then you don't have as many plants. However, while we were slowly getting to the point where the grass carp feeding was becoming less efficient, that 2023 rainstorm just jump-started everything. And then we saw this flip where the plant production was well outpacing the grass carp because there wasn't as many grass carp left in the lake at that time. And then that's where we started to see more increased plants. So we've had this major shift in the community in basically starting in 2023 moving forward. And how is this affecting everything else that we're seeing? So the increase in plants in the lake is not just confined to increasing plants and then increasing recreational issues potentially for users. It has a cascading impact down the entire ecosystem. What we seem to be seeing, and every time I talk to a fisherman on Roaring Brook Lake, I'm getting the same answer, and we're going to be doing a fish survey this year to confirm this. We are starting to get a lot larger largemouth bass, and the fishery is changing completely to what it was before. If you remember, we did a survey back in 2020 of the fish population when there was no vegetation in the lake, and the fisheries results were very stark. We had hundreds of just small bass, 11 inches, and they weren't growing much bigger because there was no vegetation to support young fish. So all these bass basically had no food that were able to grow them up to a size that they can get to 12 inches, 13 inches, 14, 15, and so on and so forth. Another consequence is that the lake actually got these really massive bluegill because you have all of these bass that are basically 11 inches and they are so hungry. So if you're a small bluegill, you need to get to a size that they can't eat. So we ended up having a ton of these large 8-9 inch bluegill. So if anyone fishing, 8-9 inch bluegill is a massive fish for that species. So we're getting these really big bluegill because there's so many small bass, so they have to grow out of that size. The reason why there's so many small bass is because there's not enough bait in the lake to support them. The reason why there's not enough bait is because there's not enough plants to fuel the bait. It's a whole complicated thing. But the idea is that all the plants are having these cascading impacts. Why this is concerned with the zooplankton is that we think that the increase in plants has increased small fish in the lake, which have started eating the zooplankton and eating them at a really high rate. That's one of our explanations for why we're seeing this decline in zooplankton. So I told you I'd bring it back to the zooplankton. And the point is that it doesn't necessarily mean that this is a automatic bad thing for the lake. It's just important to characterize what the changes are because there likely is going to be something that's going to have to be done about the plants in the future. So we need to understand what the system was before and what we could risk if, let's say, we do too much plant management. If we do too much plant management, there's a very likelihood we will go back to the fishery that we had before. That may be fine for the community, that may not be fine, but I think understanding that that is the risk of doing, let's say, too much plant management in an area is something important to think about. On the other hand, we do know that the water quality throughout this time period has actually been relatively stable and getting maybe a little bit better since even before the grass carp were declining and then during the decline. So what this tells me is that maybe water quality isn't as sensitive to these changes in the ecosystem as some of these other parameters. So these are all just important considerations because the community is going to have to make decisions about what to do with the lake in the future. The 7-foot drawdown will likely have positive impacts early this season on plants, but it will not have a long-term impact on the aquatic plants. It's not eradicating the plants in the lake. So the problem is going to keep coming up. So what we're trying to do here is really try to contextualize everything that's been going on to give your group the best tools to make a decision on what you want to do moving forward. And to end off this quick section, I created this sort of general kind of conceptual diagram of what we think is happening in Roaring Brook Lake. So the idea is that before, when there was not that much vegetation, you had a lot of high bass predation, which led to smaller bass, larger bluegill, a good amount of zooplankton. When you have a lot of vegetation, when the grass carp die off, you have larger bass, smaller, different distribution of size of bluegill, and then potentially smaller zooplankton. So this is what we think is happening in the lake. And once again, while it seems like it's a lot of ecological just voodoo and very interesting dynamics, it all comes back to, if you're going to manage the plants in the future in any way, know what you could potentially shift the system to and know what you have right now and then make the decision based on that. So last few slides, I just want to talk about some watershed impacts. Part of the reason why we have good water clarity and good water quality in the lake in general is because the watershed in general is in very good condition. There is not many major roads, even though the Taconic is in the watershed, it's a very small part of the watershed. There's not multiple homes on top of homes on top of homes. I believe Oak Ridge Drive is the only area where there's sort of two sets of, well, I guess it would be four if you think about the homes that are above and below Oak Ridge. But that's the only sort of multi-layered road system in Roaring Brook in the watershed. So you contrast that to Oscawana, Mohegan, Peekskill that have 5 or 6 or 7 different homes up, really, really steep hills and not much area to capture stormwater and septic systems. Roaring Brook benefits from the fact that the watershed is not developed. So everything we can do to keep the watershed as pristine as possible is incredibly important. And on-site wastewater is, I think, the biggest thing that we have a realistic ability to control within the lake. So just as a review, everyone on Roaring Brook Lake has some sort of a septic system. That's where your effluent goes after you go to the bathroom. Most people, it goes into some sort of a tank. That tank could be in really good condition. It could be in not so great condition. And then after, most people have what's called a distribution field, where that effluent, after it settles out in that tank, will go into a field and the bacteria is supposed to treat it. In reality, our area that we live in, they're not really suitable for septics in general. We have really a lot of bedrock, so there's not a lot of soil to be able to uptake nutrients. Also, a lot of these homes were, either seasonal camps that were transitioned to full-time homes, and these seasonal camps never had the space, and when they were initially laid out and zoned, not enough space to have an adequate leach field. So there's a lot of inherent problems with just septic systems in general. So it's incredibly important to stay on top of them. So pump and inspect your system regularly. It is incredibly important to do that. I know the group has taken great strides in that aspect, but it's important to keep doing that. However, you have to go beyond just pumping and inspecting. Most times, inspections of tanks outside of the last few years, with I know some of the efforts from the Fund from Roaring Brook and a few others, most tank inspections are just going down, opening the tank, taking a flashlight, looking at the integrity of the tank, and then checking it off. You really need to go the next step. Is the distribution line clogged? Is there any biofilm on there? Is the actual leach field at capacity? Are you starting to see, like, let's say one area of your lawn that has really abundant vegetation and then other areas don't? These are all the things that actually have the consequence on affecting the lake. Your tank is one step and it should be in good condition, but what really affects the lake is when all that material that's in the leach field can actually get into the lake, either by a higher water table or it's just a system that's at a leach field that's at capacity. So it's incredibly important to go to that next step. Don't just stop at pumping and inspecting. Any opportunity you can, move towards advanced treatment systems. Either that's the systems that have advanced peat moss, either have biological control, ones that have iron plating. Anything you can do to get that advanced treatment is incredibly important. I know there's been Fuji systems out there. There's other types of systems. I'm not here to endorse one or the other, but the idea is that we need to move beyond we need to move towards this advanced treatment because we have all these inherent problems just in our land in general that set us back, right? We can't have conventional septic systems and have them work functionally. So most of our lots need to move towards that. And I think the Property Owners Association and the town and the Fund for Roaring Brook can really play a strong role in getting that moving forward. Most likely, unless something drastic happens, this lake is never going to be sewered. You know, it's probably too many logistical issues to actually connect the sewer line, and I hope I'm wrong, right? But I think that's I think I'm safe in saying that that's very unrealistic for a total lake to be sewered. So, in lieu of that, it's incredibly important to deal with the on-site wastewater that we have. So, sort of larger aggressive measures, something like increasing, like almost having like a fund to fund maybe 50 or 75% of somebody's septic system replacement, complete replacement. Something aggressive like that could be needed in the long term to really start moving the needle on this. You know, most homeowners want to do the right thing. You know, nobody wants to be polluting the lake. It's not anybody's intention, and this is not a good guy or bad guy thing. But the reality is that when somebody needs to fix their septic system, they also have a kitchen they need to fix, or they have a driveway they need to fix, or their deck is falling apart. So there's real life choices and trade-offs that happen that unfortunately stop people from doing their septic system maintenance and getting it to that point. So I think the groups in the town can take a real strong leadership role in taking it well beyond the pumping and inspecting and moving it to a point where we can help each other out to actually move it forward. Because the end goal is to get everybody's system to the advanced treatment at some particular point, or at least get all the systems to being functioning to the best of their capacity. So I really think that's important to do, and I think the group is taking great steps. I'm not saying that the town of Putnam Valley and the association have not been doing things well. You have. You've been moving a lot more than some other towns. I can tell you that for sure. But I think that we have more work to do here. Just generally on your home, when you're around your home and there's rain drives nutrients towards the lake. So everything you can do to keep that rain on your property or manage it in the most effective way is going to be great for the lake. So just think about infiltration. If you have gutters that are coming off your house, instead of that gutter going right on your driveway and then going right out into the road, maybe have it infiltrate into a catch basin, into a rain garden, have that water diffused out, use a rain barrel as well. If you can, use porous pavement, pavers places. I know porous pavement has maintenance issues and there's upkeep that has to do with that, right? So I'm not saying that you have to do porous pavement everywhere, you have to do these solutions, but just think about when the rain hits your property, are you doing everything you can to keep it there? Because that's how these catch basins get really filled up with material, and then when there's a big storm, those catch basins can get blown out, and then more of that material enters our streams and enters our lake in general. And once again, because there's not really much commercial land, even the land that is owned by the town of Putnam Valley is very low impact. It's mostly gravel, with the beach access points. The largest areas of impervious surfaces are the roads and your property. So you have a large responsibility to try to do your best you can there. The last thing I wanted to mention, and I don't know if I brought this up with your group, but this has actually been something that's been coming up with a lot of my other lakes, and I actually don't see it talked about a lot, is construction management. So if you're doing construction on your property, obviously there's regulations that contractors need to follow through the town. And, the building inspectors have roles in making sure that, construction is done in the right way. However, you are on your property all the time. So you as a property owner have an incredible amount of responsibility to make sure that your contractors are doing things in the right way. This is a picture I took from a lake 2 years ago where they must have been either building a new septic system or maybe an in-ground pool. And it's kind of hard to see here, but the lake is right on the bottom here. And that's completely unconsolidated sediment that a very insignificant rainstorm can start to push all of that material directly into the lake. And while, yes, the building department and the regulations in that particular town should be looking at that and taking care of that, that's on your property. Right, so I think it's incredibly important to think about and talk to your contractors. Make sure that, are they using a silt fence correctly? Are they tarping material that they're digging up? Are they having enough filter socks? Are they doing everything they can to keep that material as far away from the lake? after they're done with their construction? Are they restoring the site in the most proper way possible? These are small things that sometimes you don't think about because, well, the construction, they're doing what they need to do. And it's not to say that people that, the contractors are the bad guys, but it's just, keeping everybody on top of them, honest, and, thinking about when you're doing construction on a lake and in a lake ecosystem, there really needs to be a higher standard and a higher bar for making sure that things are done the right way. So this is, once again, talking to your contractors early and often, asking them what they're going to do, asking them how they're going to do it, and then obviously interfacing with the town to make sure that the building departments also know when there could be, let's say, a potential infraction or there's something that needs to happen. So I think that's incredibly important. It's something that is not really talked about as much, so I thought it was worth bringing up as sort of a bookend here. So I spoke about a lot today. Generally, I think the lake is still in pretty good condition. As you saw from the water quality, the lake is really good. We still have a long way to go though. We have this aquatic plant issue that's coming up, and we have these larger ecosystem changes, which are going to be important for us to think about as we make a decision. Do we want to stock grass carp again? Do we want to entertain an herbicide? Do we want to do harvesting? All of those have consequences. So understanding what those consequences are going to be really, really important, because we don't want to get to a situation where we just do something and then have no reasonable expectation of what's going to happen. And then, the fishermen who've been enjoying this great fishing that they've had are just going to go back to having a really subpar fishery, or there's going to be, or maybe there's not enough management, and then folks in the North Basin, their use of the North Basin is going to be completely different now than it's ever been before. So all of these things are incredibly important to understand. But I want to leave you on a positive note. Roaring Brook Lake is in a really good position. Your group is moving in the right direction. You're thinking about the right things. And once again, I'll take any questions.
How do you increase the number of zooplankton? If it's decreasing, how do you increase it?
If I may,
Yeah.
can you answer a question? If you don't mind just repeating the question, because the people that are watching the video later won't hear it.
Yeah. So increasing the number of zooplankton, you could do that in a few ways. One, the food web way is to reduce the amount of fish in the lake. What I think is important to think about the zooplankton is it's incredibly hard to reduce the number of fish in a lake without culling them. And, that becomes a whole process. Back in 2020, when we did the fish survey, we tentatively brought that up to the DEC for a different reason. Because one of the ways to get larger fish would be to take out a bunch of fish and let the other ones grow. DEC was not really amenable to that. They were, but there was a lot of hoops that they wanted us to jump through to be able to do that. So that would be the one way to potentially do that. I think, though, what we need to do is, while the decrease in zooplankton is not great, we need to also balance that with what else is happening. What the decrease in zooplankton is telling us more is that the lake ecosystem is changing, and I'm not sure that we are seeing negative impacts on the water quality because the zooplankton have declined. And even though we have that decline in zooplankton, our clarity has been great. So I'm not ready to say that there's this one-to-one, oh my God, the zooplankton automatically decline, so the clarity is going to automatically get worse. So you can control them by doing that, but I think it's a little too early to think about something like that. If the water clarity was just getting worse and worse and worse, then maybe we can think about something else on that level, but we just haven't seen that.
So my question is, do we have a sense of how many carp remain in the lake, and would you recommend replenishment of the carp?
So the question was, do we have a sense of the number of carp in the lake, and do we recommend replenishment of those carp? So all the estimates are very rough, and there's a whole science behind why they're rough, but generally I would say there's probably under 60 carp left-ish. The way we come up with that number is, last year I had what's called a life table, where we look at, you take the 500 carp and we assume they don't reproduce, and we haven't seen evidence of that in Roaring Brook, and you assume that 20 or 30% die each year, and you take that through time, and we got to 84 carp in 2025. So with the 20% decline, we're in that 60-ish range. I would say that the issue with putting carp back in is a fewfold. One, DEC is going to be a lot more strict one thing that's happened is a lot of other lakes have stocked carp and lost all their vegetation, either immediately or over time. Lake Mayapack, Lake Carmel, Oscawana is recently going through that issue, Orange Lake, Putnam Lake. I mean, the number of lakes that have stocked carp and lost all vegetation for not just 1 year, but multiple years is numerous. Lake Peekskill at some point early on, they stocked carp and they lost a lot of their vegetation. So DEC is not just going to hand out a permit. And what I think that tells us is that we need to be more judicious about making that decision in the future. You could stock a smaller amount of carp to see what happens. However, you really need to be on top of that, because one thing that happens as well is that when a lake stocks a small amount of carp, in trying to be responsible, you will not see the impacts immediately. And then residents become very anxious and impatient for those impacts to happen, and then they want to go stock more and more carp over time. We've seen this on plenty of lakes where initially it's a responsible low stocking, but then after 2 or 3 years, when the vegetation still hasn't declined, there's a push to do more and more and more. And the problem is that these carp survive for a long time, and they don't stop eating when they get older. So it creates an issue where you actually overstock while you're trying to be comfortable. So I would not say it's off the table, but we need to be really careful about how we do it this time versus how it was done last time.
Hi, thank you for this. As I recall, the Putnam Valley challenge, we went with the DEC and they gave us a recommendation way back when, and we put in that amount of fish. We never put in more fish after that, but it was their base minimum amount that they would recommend to us, and we chose that, we did that. So the interesting thing is we put in, they did 500 to something, we did 500. So I think one of the things we might want to look at is if we put in a 500 number way back when, and these things have happened to it, how much of a jolt do we want to add to it at what time, so that we can inform people, and then they don't get upset about it, these fish aren't doing their job, because we've informed them, this is the history, this is what we learned, this is why we're doing what we're doing now, and we're doing it. And then they'll calm down, and they'll all fish.
So just to repeat for the camera, the comment was generally, and hopefully I'm getting this right, that if there is another carp stocking that happens, we want to make sure there's more information to the community that these are the realistic expectations, and I think that's generally true. You want
History built in.
Yeah, you want to be more you want to be more you want to be more forward with people about that. While that's a good thing to do, by no guarantee does that translate to the community at large. We've seen this with a lot of different lakes where you do as much public communication that you want. However, new residents move in, different expectations. 3 or 4 years is a long time. Especially when people have their lives and stuff, and so there's been many lakes where that has been tried, but it sometimes doesn't always materialize. So I think it's a good thing, but with anything like that, I think there needs to be incredible caution. So what I would suggest is that if the group wanted to go the grass carp route, which I know we've spoken about before in the past, we need to continue to pair it with these aquatic plant surveys that will tell us if the vegetation is actually declining, is it increasing, or is it staying the same. One thing I didn't mention is that from 2011 to 2019, there was only one survey done in 2016, 5 years after. And that survey was not used for any sort of management one way or the other. So we really had no idea what was going on in that sort of time block in terms of science. The other thing too is that we had no capacity to remove the carp if we thought that there were too many early on. So if there was another stocking, my suggestion is if we start to see a little bit of a decline in the vegetation, we have to automatically start removing carp that same year, because we know that decline is going to be almost a cliff, and we need to get ahead of it. In a lot of lakes, they think that the impacts are going to, we're really not good at, and when I say we, like the scientific community and the lake managers are not great at figuring out exactly when these carp are going to have their impact. Sometimes it's 4 years down the road, sometimes it's 3. So what we need to do is we need to be as responsive as possible. So if we start seeing a decline in the vegetation, we have to come out, we need to remove carp to get that to the point where instead of the vegetation bottoming out, it can sort of smoothly kind of maybe decline and then come up a little bit, you stock a little bit more, and then it comes down. I make that sound easy. It is not easy. And that's why grass carp stockings are incredibly hard to get right.
Well, those little
utilizing them. We put 500 in the minimum DEC recommendation, and it worked.
I would say it worked if your sole concern was reducing the aquatic plants throughout the lake without consideration for natives or total vegetation coverage. I would say that that worked. If you are a fisherman who cares about fishing, that didn't work for you.
Absolutely.
You know, and but this is lake management.
40 years,
But
it
this
didn't change. That's crazy.
So
That's what the fishermen told us, and that's why we looked at it and wanted to go into a phase two, which we haven't been allowed to do, but go into a phase two, taking their recommendation and the number into
We
consideration.
put 440 in,
Yeah.
because there's 60 left,
Yeah.
500 worked.
Yeah.
Put 440 in.
So I just want to bring us back to the slide that you showed that had a little notation with 2016 and 2017 of a problem with bladderwort. It sounds like, oh, slope, there was a problem with bladderwort. Now, that problem was horrendous. It was, I think it was 2017, but, yeah, if you look at that, we don't know exactly what has happened in the 15 years since we put the carp in. I almost said the crap.
You did say that. You actually did say it.
But over that time, we had 1 year, which was absolutely the worst year that residents of this lake who have been here for 40 years have ever seen. We had just absolutely no use of the lake during that season, and it was horrible. That may be totally unrelated to the carp, but there is a small chance that the carp were eating things that were more desirable to them, and that gave an ecological opening to the bladderwort. But that was a really bad time. If you look at the whole time frame, the whole 15 years since we put the carp in, we basically had a really bad year about 7 years after we put them in, and we didn't start having a good year until about 2021, in my opinion, and then we had about 4 good years. So I think some of the looking at this as being a real success for the swimmers and boaters, even if you put the fishing aside, it really wasn't. We got a small amount about 10 years afterwards, lasting about 4 years. So I don't think that was a good return on it.
Yeah, in the grand scheme of all the lakes that have stocked carp in the Northeast, in Northeast and in New York, and we did a study a few years ago looking at all the different lakes that were stocked in all throughout the lower Hudson area from 1991 to 2021. This is another project our company did. You know, Roaring Brook was one of the few ones that did not have the significant, immediate, detrimental impacts that these other lakes have had in terms of decreased water quality, consistent increased HABs. However, I would say that's more because the watershed is so well protected, that the normal transition between plants to algae, which happens in all the other lakes that stock grass carp and wipe out all the vegetation, didn't happen because our watershed is so protected and our quality is so good. So what I would say is that any success we had from the carp was mostly due to the fact that the lake is just in a unique position that it doesn't have many nutrients to potentially have those issues. But lake management using a lake is not just one use. So you can't say one thing is you unequivocally a success on one end and something else is unequivocally not a success on the other end. You know, think about like the drawdown, for example. You know, when we think about the drawdown, and we have this conversation every few years, the drawdown is not a universally good or universally bad thing for the lake. It's universally good if you want to keep plants out of your shoreline area. It's universally bad if you want to grow plants and you want to have a nice ecosystem of, you know, a thriving ecosystem next to your lake area. So it's not, I think, instructive to look at things as a complete success or a complete failure. When you look at things moving forward, it's important to see what do we potentially risk losing if we go too aggressive next time. I can't tell you for a fact that Roaring Brook's water quality is going to be excellent if we stock the same amount of carp and the same thing happened. It's a potential, and it's probably a greater potential than all the other lakes that in this area, but I would not say it's an automatic, it's an automatic, it's gonna be a success. When you lose all the vegetation in your lake, you are really playing with fire, especially in a shallow lake. So, you know, I would suggest if the grass carp are done, they need to be done in a much more strict and watched way, so we can really minimize that chance of anything happening in the future. Mike?
I seem to recall somebody, maybe you, saying that if we don't right-size the amount of carp that we were to add, that because of the small amount of carp, they'll be more selective in some of the natural occurring plants there rather than the invasive plants that we're actually trying to get rid of.
Yes, so at low carp densities, carp can be selective. Really, you can think of them as like selective generalists. They will eat everything, but they have priorities, and they have preferences. There are certain plants they like to eat, there's other ones they don't, but they will eat everything. It is not, it's only algae and only certain types of algae that they will completely avoid. So I'm gonna bring up the Lake Oscawana example, because I think it's really, it's a good example for a low carp stocking. So in Lake Oscawana, they stocked 600 carp in 2016. And that was a very low stocking number, even by DEC standards, by what you would think. After 2016, and I was working at Northeast Aquatic Research with Hillary Kenyon, who works on that project as well, and we were monitoring the aquatic plants every single year. The big problems, the milfoil and the large-leaf pondweed, were not touched for many years after that. However, in our data, one of the most valuable plants, it's called Robbins pondweed, was declining every single year. And it was being replaced by this filamentous cyanobacteria that grass carp will not eat, called Lingdia. It's like this black algae. So even though the residents were not seeing any major differences in the aquatic plant community, we were seeing it in our surveying, and we knew the grass carp were working, but they weren't having like the major impacts. The community wanted to stock more carp because they weren't seeing the necessary reductions in the major plants that were causing their issues. In I forget, I'm gonna get the years wrong, but I believe it might have been 21, 443 carp were stocked, so a smaller amount. So in theory, exactly what you would think is a responsible stocking, right? We did 600 one year, that was initially low, we didn't stock the year after, we waited a while, we monitored the community, and we stocked a lower amount after. Oscawana Lake lost most of its vegetation 2 years after and still has an extremely low amount of vegetation in the lake. So even with a low stocking, even when you're trying to do it in a responsible way, you still really risk the chance of losing everything. And I think we can't manage the lake with trying to lose, potentially everything.
So we have to come a little bit late, so I apologize if this was covered.
No, of course, yeah.
The last time we talked, you also mentioned that some of the lakes were doing some piloting with Procellacor, and I'm just wondering whether there's been any new information on the success or failure of those pilots.
Yeah, so just for everyone, the question was about Procellacor. That's an herbicide that's been used recently, and it's very specific to milfoil. So I wouldn't say there's anything significant that's happened in the last year. What we've seen, at least in the lakes that we've monitored, is it's confirming that about 3 to 4 years of control is what you usually get out of a Procellacor treatment. On the lower end, if you only do a partial treatment and more milfoil comes in. It's on the higher end if you manage it with another type of technique. So for example, in the Sedgwick Club in China Pond, they did a treatment in 2021, and they combined divers as well to sort of try to pick off the plants that were coming back, and that actually bought them an extra whole year of not having to do management. So instead of having to do a Procellacor treatment 4 years later, now they're thinking about doing it this year when they treated it in 21. So they got an extra whole year out of management. But I wouldn't say nothing's really significantly changed. What we spoke about before is generally the same. It can be very effective to control Eurasian water milfoil. It's not your silver bullet long-term, solution to aquatic plants if you use that herbicide, but it will definitely knock down the milfoil, and it will knock it down for likely more than 1 or 2 years. In Roaring Brook Lake, the caveat we've always had is that in that North Basin especially, milfoil is not the only species that's there. So while you will get a reduction in the milfoil, there might be something else, either a native species like a large-leaf palmweed or another invasive like fanwort that might come in and grow in its place. It might look different, so that's the only caveat there. It's not to say it's not a good idea, but once again, it's thinking about the consequences of using it. So the expectation shouldn't be, oh, we're going to use this, and then it's automatically going to be plant-free for the next, 4 or 5 years. That's an unrealistic expectation. So nothing's really changed all that much, except for nothing has come up that say that, oh, there's a much different way we need to use it or anything like that.
Just a process question might go to Allison or someone else, but last time we stocked it with grass carp, we talked about it for about 5 years ahead of that. And during that time, the lake became almost unusable.
Yeah.
I was there, right? We couldn't boat on it. The weeds were getting. So I want to understand, like, I just want to make a decision on this, just personally.
Sure.
So if we made a decision today, stocking, or let's say we've made a decision to stock some carp, how long does that take to actually put the fish in the lake? I know because after you put the fish in the lake, then it takes a few years for them to actually have any impact. So if you were to, and the question was, sorry, I keep remembering to repeat the questions here. The question was, what would be the process if we were to, let's say, make a management decision right now, with the example being grass carp? If you were to decide to do stock grass carp today, you probably wouldn't have them until next year. Part of the reason is because DEC has become a lot more strict on how they're doing the grass carp. There's a lot of lakes that you're telling flat out no's to. So what would likely have to happen is we would have to come up with a number that made sense from us, propose that to DEC, and propose them a plan to actually deal with the carp moving forward. How are we going to remove them if they become too if they have too many, if they're eating too many plants too quickly? How do we monitor the impacts each year? They are definitely going to be requiring full lake surveys, which they didn't require back when the initial stocking happened in 2011, and likely by a professional. And that's one of the pitfalls of the grass carp stockings back early on, is they could have anybody on any lake just write up, oh yeah, we have a bunch of weeds, so let's go stock grass carp. And it could be, there was examples of people coloring in a shading like map of the lake and just saying that they're weeds, and the state would accept that as evidence, and then they would give them however many carp to do that. So that whole process would probably take a whole year, considering it takes some time for the carp to actually start making an impact because they're small at first and they don't eat as much, right?
Yes, and also and also they have to get, the plants are already kind of rearing, and it would take them a while to do that, especially in the scenario you would stock lower carp. So you probably wouldn't see impacts for 3 to 4 years, I would think, at the most, if it's a small amount.
So maybe this is not a question for Allison. When are we slated to make a decision on what to do, or if any?
Well, I have a question. What is the lowest amount of carp you can stock?
Probably in
You could stop one. Functionally. So, yeah.
Minimum.
So there's not necessarily a minimum in terms of the regulations. What we'd want to do is we want to really go back and think about it over a 10-year time span and say, all right, what's the number of carp we eventually want to get to if we stock a small amount in 3-year increments, let's say. So let's say we want to get back to that. Let's say we want to get to 400 carp, but we want to get there over a small period of time. And we think 400 is a reasonable number. And let's say we stock 80 and then we stock 60. And so you could do that over time, but the idea is that in between those, you're looking at the plants and you're saying, all right, I'm not stocking my lake unless I'm seeing an actual increase in the plants over time. Because what we know is that even if the plant population is stable, those carp can still be eating. So then you don't want to sort of overstock and do the double stock like other lakes have done. So there's no minimum number, but in reality, the strategy would be a small amount of carp spaced out by a few different years with good monitoring in between to understand when we're potentially going to hit that point. And then once we think we're going to hit the point where maybe the plants are going to start to drop off, we cut it off and we start to even pull carp out.
Would you submit that to DEC as a plan if we were going to do that? How many this year monitoring, 3 years from now we put more in, 3 years after that we put more in? Is that the plan, or do you have to go through the DEC process every time you're going to put security pipe?
So a little bit of both. You're still going to have to apply for carp each time. There's not like a blanket permit that gives out. Each permit that's given out is for one instance of stocking. However, you would submit that entire plan, so then when you do that third stocking, let's say in 6 or 7 years, then the DEC sees, hey, listen, we're on year 6 of our 10-year plan, and then that permit process is a lot more thought out. Now, you still have to go through the initial permitting process, which is going to require the fish stocking permit and might also require a wetland permit. Those questions are a little more up in the air because of what's happening at Albany right now, but that would be the general process. And DC may just say no. They have been extremely gun shy to stock lakes again. And the problem is they don't have like straight guidance that they've put out to say, all right, this is our new 100% statewide policy on grass carp stockings. In reality, most regional fish managers are basically like, no, unless there is an absolute dire reason. So my suspicion is they're going to immediately say no, and it's going to be the burden on us to give them a very strong, thought out plan to get them to move away from their no position to maybe like a potential trial. And they may just say no outright.
So, do you think from what from what you've told us today and from your research, that the lake does require some stocking?
No. The reason I say that is because I am not confident, even with that plan that I laid out, that's a theoretical plan. That would be the best way you can do it. But there really hasn't been a great example of any lake controlling grass carp or controlling plants in an intermediate fashion just using grass carp. Lake Mayapack is trying it, but they're still really, really low on their vegetation. They're much lower below their goal most recently. It's just not something we've seen happen. They tried it over in Candlewood Lake as well. They tried to do smaller stockings, and they ended up wiping everything out. There's another lake next there, Ball Pond, where they tried doing like 30 fish, 50 fish, a really tiny amount. They ended up wiping everything out anyway. So my professional opinion is that the grass carp stockings by themselves are too volatile, and there's too many unknowns to accurately say you're not going to ever wipe your vegetation out. So that's my suggestion.
So what other options are there other than carp and the herbicide that was mentioned? Obviously, I know Lake Oskalon has a harvester, which is very expensive. But
Yeah.
what other tools are there to manage?
So with the heart, I could talk. So the question was other tools. Sorry, I keep every 5 questions I keep repeating. So you can harvest in a lake. Mechanical harvesters come in many different shapes and sizes. The ones on Oscawana are your traditional harvesters that harvest and then also pull the plants on at the same time. There's ones that just cut. There's ones that just kind of skim the water. Harvesting is best when you have navigational issues. And it's best when you have an area where, let's say, folks that are living, and Ina, I'm going to pick on you because your house is right in that example area, is let's say Ina had no ability to get to the middle of the lake. The plants were so dense that even with kayaking or canoeing, she just could not get out there. That would be a use case for doing like a mechanical harvesting, because mechanical harvesting does not reduce plants over time. It just opens up access, which can be valuable. It's not to say that's not a valuable thing, but it means that it can't fit into every specific situation correctly. So the times we've seen mechanical harvesting be the most useful is actually on really large lakes that are really shallow. So Chautauqua Lake way out in the west, even your southern reservoirs that let's say are hundreds of acres and like 6 feet deep as an average depth. So you have hundreds of acres of plants where people can't get out. Harvesters are great for that because then they can cut these lanes, people can use the water body, and they're only cutting them, between like Memorial Day and Labor Day, and access is awesome. Any other use of the mechanical harvesters, they become really inefficient and they're not really going to get the job done. So if the goal is just navigation and getting people one place to the else, yeah, you could think about a harvester. But if your goal is anything else besides that, it's not something I would really consider. And then you have the question of, all right, are you going to buy a harvester and run it? Let's say like Oscawana does it. Or are you going to bring in a contractor? You can bring in a contractor, but then you have to worry about invasive species being introduced through that contractor. Are you going to have enough money to pay them to do all the amount of harvesting you're going to need from them? So that's one. You can use, yeah. So divers. So divers are another tool. So divers can go in, and it's called DASH, Diver Assisted Suction Harvesting, where divers go down and they pull individual plants and they put them into a bag that goes up on top of a pontoon boat. It's a very selective technique, but as you can probably imagine as I'm saying this, it's very inefficient. A diver needs about 2 to 10 days to clear 1 acre of plants. The North Basin plant infestation is roughly 20 acres, 25 acres, and then the cost is like $2,800 a day. So you can think about those numbers just going up exponentially. So divers are not good for large infestations. If you have a small infestation, they're really good. So really, in reality, grass carp and herbicides are the 2 most relevant tools. The drawdown will help in some of the shallow water areas, and this year was a very extreme drawdown, based on the history of Roaring Brook Lake. I doubt that drawdown is going to be something that can continue every single year and it's going to have the same level of effectiveness. And also, when you draw down a lake, just because you draw down 7 feet doesn't mean you're going to be clear of plants in the waters that are 7 feet or shallower. Because that deep zone, that area that's 7 to 8, 9 feet, that's the area that is last to be dry and the first to be wet, like in the spring when it refills. So oftentimes we see the impacts, plants are still growing in that area. So think about the North Basin, the max depth of the North Basin is like 8 feet in the middle. So you probably get some shoreline control of plants in the North Basin this year, but it'll likely be very muted. So draw down something that might be able to help you each year, but it's not something that's going to really, I think, be a significant lake-wide impact through the long term. There are some areas where the drawdown has helped, especially areas that are a little deeper, that has helped reduce plants over time, but you're talking a 0 to 2, 3 foot small zone.
AJ, could we just go to the DEC at this point and say, here's our experience, here's where we are, we're thinking of moving forward, and we would like your up-to-date requirements so that we work toward those requirements as we have these conversations and decide what to do? I mean, it seems to me if we get all of our ducks in a row thinking we've done that, which we're trying very hard to do, and then take it to them and say, okay, we'd like a permit, they're going to say, well, we wish we'd started with you sooner because we have like these 10 things we need you to do.
Yeah.
So could we just make a phone call and just say, we're thinking about it?
Yeah.
No commitments, we're thinking about it. What should we be doing in order to satisfy your?
Yeah, so the DEC, so the question was basically about what steps we need to take with the DEC before we file a permit. There's a process called a pre-application permit, and basically we would send like a formal email to them, laying out whatever technique we would like to do, and laying out what we think, we'd ask some questions in there. So I just did this for a lake that wanted to try to control snails. So what I did is I sent an email to the DEC saying this is what we like to do, these are the permits we think we need, can you confirm that this is right, and then a few other questions about how much monitoring that's needed. I think that would be that's the right thing to do for any technique.
Can we do it? Can we roll?
That's up to you. So this is, as your consultant, I can only give you the options as in the path to take forward, but as the community, and this is the conversation we've had for a few years now, is, I can only give you the options and the pros and cons and I can give you what I think will work, but I can't decide for your community what you 100% should do.
You taking a vote?
So,
I don't know what we're voting on.
yeah. Oh, so, sorry, gentleman in the back, you haven't.
Yeah, just in the set of choices, you talked about mechanical, you talked about divers, you talked about carp. Is it the same process with DS if you're gonna try herbicide or some combination of them? Like is that a situation where you need to kind of figure out, okay, how far ahead of time do you need to be making an application for that?
Yeah, so with the herbicide, we actually have a much better idea of what that timeline is. If you were to do an herbicide in the lake, you could make the decision, barring town processes, you can make the decision in December, get the permit in January, and be ready to treat in April. It might be a little bit more or less, depends on if there's, public comment, but that's a generally laid out process. We know what permits you're likely going to need. You're definitely going to need an aquatic pesticide permit. You may need a wetland permit, but besides that, there's probably not many other permits you're going to need. You have to think about what's happening on the downstream, so the DC is going to have questions about is water being released from the dam, because will the herbicide flow down there? If it flows down, how far will it go? But all that process is actually relatively laid out. So of all the techniques that we talked about, the herbicide process is probably the one we know the most about. We could be the most realistic. The grass carp one's the tough one because DEC is not released like they're, once again, they don't have that statement that says, all right, this is what you need now for a grass carp permit, and this is the timeline or anything like that. So herbicide, we actually know how to do that. Sarah?
So you had said earlier that in your professional opinion, you didn't think carp was the right approach, but I wonder what your professional opinion is about Priscilla.
So I think that my professional opinion is I think the lake can do both grass carp and Priscilla. And I think if it's done, I think if they're both done at the same time in the right way, it can be pretty responsible management. As I said before, Priscilla can definitely control the erosion water milfoil, but we have other plants that are potentially causing issues. And to me, that's the biggest concern about using Priscilla is that there's going to be an expectation, as much as we want to say it in the meetings that it's selective and it's only going to hit this certain things, when people hear that an herbicide is going to be used in the lake, the expectation is that all the plant problems are going to be gone. And that's not the reality of it. So my suggestion would be, we already do drawdowns that handle the shallow water. And the Priscilla could be used in select areas, let's say the North Basin itself, or maybe outside of Moon Beach itself, to control your erosion water milfoil that's there. And then use a really small number of carp, over a long period of time, and slowly monitor that to try to control the other species that are in the lake. Once again, this is really dependent on watching the lake each year and seeing when we need to sort of put things on the gas or not. The advantage of using an herbicide is that once you put it in and once it degrades, there's not like lingering effects on plants outside of like the milfoil being, it's not like you're going to have this lingering negative effect on a plant like 10 years later, unlike a grass carp would have. So the herbicide has that flexibility. So that would be my overall suggestion, is we choose some areas to do with an herbicide treatment that are targeted, small areas where we can control the milfoil. We do a low stocking of carp to just make sure they can maybe control a bunch of other things that are out there, the fanwort, the large-leaf pondweed, but also, once again, monitor the lake, keep our vegetation in mind, and then the minute we start to see any sort of decline that's out of our control, so that what an example of that would be, if we treated, let's say, outside of Moon Beach and in the North Basin, and then we started to see a decline of fish, vegetation in the south of the lake, we immediately say, all right, no more carp stocking. We need to start pulling them out. We need to start shifting away. And at least that way, we can put our foot on the pedal and we can put our foot on the brake. Now, will DEC accept that? I hope, but once again, they are very gun shy with carp at all, so that's going to be, I think, the biggest uphill battle. But that would be my recommendation for how to do the management on Roaring Brook Lake with plants.
There's sort of a lot of things here.
Yeah.
So you can definitely take a multifaceted approach toward this. The Priscilla is applied locally, like specifically on spot?
Yes.
Okay. And if you apply it, what sort of time do you get clearing of the milfoil for?
Yeah, so what we see is the Priscilla itself, the chemistry acts within like 6 or 10 hours.
Okay.
The actual browning of the plants, so what will happen is you'll see just stalks and the leaves will actually fall off, but the stalks will be there in about 2 weeks.
Okay.
And then about 4 to 6 weeks, it's completely gone.
And for how long is it for?
Usually depends anywhere from, I said 3 to 4, but if you're doing a partial treatment, like 2 to 4 years.
Okay. So, and there's nothing that precludes doing Priscilla and carp at the same time?
Nothing that precludes it in the regulations. The state would likely, now, I'm guessing here, because sometimes the one arm of the state doesn't talk to the other arm.
Yep.
But if they were, they would say, well, are you stocking, we want to make sure your carp aren't, it's not like an additive effect, because you're also doing a drawdown as well. So that's why it needs to be extremely careful. But yes, there's nothing precluding it from the regulations from doing them all at the same time.
Yeah, because the thought was, I guess, it sounds like it takes a few years for carp that are put into the lake to actually start to eat enough to make a change. So if you were to do Priscilla and carp at the same time, the Priscilla would initially take care of some of the milfoil, and for a few years, it sounds like. And at the same time, the carp would have time to grow and then slowly start to maybe keep it in control. So
That's the theory.
Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the theory.
Okay.
Maybe you don't do a drawdown in that first year if you treated with the Priscilla, is that?
Yeah, or the drawdown stays relatively minimal. I mean, the whole point of doing all of this is to make sure that we don't dip below a critical amount of vegetation. That to me should be like the non-negotiable. We cannot get to no vegetation in the lake. The way we get there, I think, is the question about how we're being responsible. But once again, to that's a great plan, but DC needs to see that plan throughout its entirety, because they're gonna have questions and say, well, are you gonna, we've had all these other lakes that have tried to be responsible with carp and they haven't been. So, that's gonna be in their minds when they're looking at these permits.
So, I think one of the things that we're trying to do is balance different people's recreational uses of the lake. And so a question I have is if we go down the path of both carp and Priscilla, I wonder if the Priscilla works to reduce the milfoil. But there are also people who wish to fish.
Yeah.
What if we were to introduce wide-mouth bass instead? So the people who want to fish get the fish they want,
Yeah.
and the people who want to get rid of the weeds we have other methods for getting rid of weeds that don't run into this difficulty with kind of ecological management of carp. Is there a way we can satisfy everybody with a non-carp, pro-fish management?
Yeah, so the question was, is there a possibility to stock bass to maybe offset the impacts of what the vegetation decline could be? And there are lakes that stock bass. In my opinion, bass are so prolific that as long as you don't wipe everything out, they're gonna be fine, and they're gonna grow big. There's a reason why the DEC allows you to take 5 of them up to 12 inches from June 30th out to the end of the year, because they are extremely prolific. So I am not really a big fan of stocking bass in lakes that already have bass, because if you just keep the habitat intact, then there's no reason why they shouldn't get bigger. And once again, if you have sufficient amount of plants, you have a sufficient amount of bait fish, which are able to grow these bass to large sizes. Oscawana for years has had really excellent bass fishery because they have a sufficient vegetation and they can grow largemouth bass to these 18, 19, 20 inch, 4 or 5 pound sizes that we've seen. So I'm not a big fan of stocking fish in general, because I feel like most situations that stock fish are trying to solve a problem that's not actually there. So when you go back to our initial survey in 2020, one of the reasons we did that is because there was a line item in the budget to just stock bait fish indefinitely. And what we found is that basically that bait fish stocking was doing absolutely nothing to drive the actual growth of the fish, because no matter if you put in I forget, I think the number was like $6,000 a year-ish for bait. That was like a drop in the drop in the drop in a bucket to actually what makes fish larger. And what we saw in our survey is that despite all these years of bait fish stocking, all the fish were really small and really skinny. So usually you need to get to like $50,000 worth of bait each year to even start to see that change. So me professionally, I think that stocking fish, unless you're in a pond and you want like a different type of fishery, is not something that can offset it. What you can think about doing is maybe putting artificial habitat in the lake, maybe either Christmas trees or different types of structure that could potentially buffer against, let's say, the vegetation going down. That's not easy, you need a lot of it. And then you have the potential navigational concern. What if that tree floats up and goes somewhere? But that is a technique you could potentially use. But my first thing is to say, just don't wipe all the vegetation out. We know that if you have an intermediate amount of vegetation, you will grow bass, and you will grow big bass. Mike?
Well, it seems like Priscilla is a good solution. When that was brought up to the community, there was a large outpouring against the use of any kind of pesticides in the water. So if that's, there's a town board there, if that's a possible solution, just be aware that there's a lot of people that are against it.
Yeah, pests, and people should be skeptical of anything that's being introduced into the lake. This is not to say that every single pesticide is, amazing and it never has any impacts. That's not true, and that's not true to what we've happened. What we do know is that the pesticides that are being used now are under the most scrutiny of not even just pesticides in, back 20, 30 years, of any single technique. One of the reasons why we're so uncertain about grass carp is that the literature, like the scientific literature that we know about grass carp and we know about herbicides and pesticides, is a chasm of a difference. We know so much about these pesticides in terms of how they work, how they break down, which species they impact, which ones they don't, what's the safe dose, how to apply it, and then we have hundreds of lakes that we've applied it to, and I would say we, because I personally don't apply them, but the industry has applied them to where we have not seen these impacts. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be skeptical of it, that doesn't mean you shouldn't double check it, that doesn't mean you shouldn't ask right questions about it, but in our experience, pesticides use in lakes is generally a safe thing to do. And the reason why I think it's a useful tool is that it is controllable. You're not going to have a situation where you put a pesticide into a lake and then you're going to have these long-term 15-year impacts. We have not seen that in the literature. However, with grass carp, you know that maybe that didn't happen in Roaring Brook Lake to the same extent that it happened in other lakes, but you know that if you get grass carp stockings wrong, you will have decades long of impacts.
You see where that gets us with vaccines, right? We have all this literature.
Yeah.
Same.
No, and once again, if the group does not want to use pesticides, that's perfectly fine. There's no, my stance is not to say, even though in my professional opinion that could be a useful tool, it's not to say you can't manage your lake without pesticides. There's plenty of lakes that do it. The question is that there's different things you need to do, though, to make sure that management is successful. Because the whole point of management is making sure that people can use the lake to the best of their ability without making sure the ecosystem crashes off. So if it's carp, we can try to do it with carp. If it's herbicides, we can try to do it with herbicides. So it's not to say that one is necessarily the automatic right choice over the other one. Sarah?
I just want to remind everybody of what happened last year, because I think the process was very confusing to a lot of people. At the POA meeting where we actually took a vote, it was sort of an advisory vote, it was actually in favor of Cell being applied. And then the decision was made, I believe, by the Lake Preservation Committee not to do anything other than drawdown, which was then a very large drawdown that no one really discussed. So because we have this complicated process of Roaring Brook Lake, it's always confusing who's actually in charge and who's actually making the decisions. And the POA is the public forum, but the Lake Preservation Committee doesn't actually have public meetings, and the decision gets made in conjunction with the town board. So whatever decision gets made, I think it would be helpful to clarify the process and figure out what, if any, public input you want in that process.
Yeah, no, that...
Hard thing to summarize, sorry.
No, I mean, I think the point about the process to make the decision is a salient one. And I'm more than happy to do it. I have no problem talking about this, but the reality is that we have been talking about this for a few years. And I think the one thing that is played in our favor is that the plants, I think, have not reached a critical mass. And unfortunately, most lakes decide to do management well after plants reach a point where they probably should have been managed before. So I'm not saying that we have to have this urgency, but this is why I was trying to bring this up even before the plants became an issue, because we need to start thinking about this. My one solid recommendation is, I think, to reach out to DEC about the grass carp, because at least there we can get clarity to see if it is a complete no or if there's a path. Because if it's a complete no, then there's no point in us doing a whole permit to even go to that, mixed approach. So until we know what DEC will actually say about it or what their requirements are, I think that might be a good first step. And then once again, that's not me endorsing grass carp or not. I think that's getting the clarity on it. Because I can be pretty confident that the state is not, if you wanted to apply for an herbicide, the state's not going to automatically say no. There might be a bunch of other reasons why you don't do it, but it's not going to be on the state just shutting it down. We don't know really that for grass carp one way or the other.
Well, I said that would be a good place to start, to at least ask the question, if that would be possible. And then if we are doing a combined approach, it sounds like it would make sense to apply in December for the spring, if the Priscillicor were going to be used. And and that'll give us a little time to try to...
And the other thing too, I'll add to that, I'll get to you in just one second. And I mentioned this before, you can apply for a pesticide permit and not use it. You do not have to use it if you apply for it. There is no legal, you're not going to get dinged by DEC. DEC is not going to say you have to do this. And the reason why I say that is because sometimes decisions take a lot longer. And if you had like a year where you were thinking you were going to have a serious plant problem and you didn't even have the permit in place, if the community just decided that they wanted to use it, you already lost that season.
Is that just pesticide though? We can't go ahead with carp and then decide not to use that? No.
Yeah, same thing with carp. I mean, if you got a carp permit, you could decide not to do it as a community. You know, same thing with harvesting. I mean, a permit just gives you the permission to do it. It doesn't legally bind you
Does
to.
the permit limit the amount of herbicide or the number of carp?
Yes, they would limit both. Usually what will happen is for the pesticide, whatever applicator you're working with will propose the amount of treatment area, and then the DEC will say yay or nay to those treatment areas. Normally, they will not want like an entire lake dosage. So likely they will never say 100 acres of treatment. The maximum you would probably get is what's called the size of the littoral zone, so the area that would grow. So my guess is that the maximum amount of herbicide you would be allowed to put in is like 70 acres, 80. In reality, you might do a partial one that's maybe 10, 20 acres, North Basin in certain sections. Carp, they will give you a maximum number of carp, and potentially they might tell you how like many years in the interval you can stock them. This is one of the things we just don't know because they've changed the way they think about it. But they will limit. They will not usually give a blanket, permit for like how much you can do. Only stuff like hand harvesting, which is very low impact, they'll say, oh, you can do sort of how much you want.
Well, it sounds to me, based on your professional opinion, and if I may, we're going to try to make a plan to move things forward, that it would make sense to reach out to the DEC to see if there's any possibility of carp. You're recommending if there is, it would be a low number, and that if we were to apply for the permit, we're possibly using Percelicorn, was that right? And it would be in a very targeted area, that if we are putting this plan together, to then present to the community and say, this is our plan, and maybe it would include a more minimal drawdown, since you guys did a really big one this last year, and say, here's our plan to the community, and see how they respond to it, and then we can start to take those action steps moving forward.
Yeah, I think so. I think that would be a good idea. We've spent, and once again, I think it's time well spent, but we spent many years talking about the different options, the pros and cons, and that doesn't mean everybody has heard them, right? Because, while everyone here is a really engaged members of the community, there's 300 members of the Roaring Brook Lake community, and not everyone's heard it. So I'm more than happy to keep talking about it. I think it's important to do that. So yes, I think that would be the general way that would make sense to do that, and then we can see what happens from there, and then adjust. So you've been waiting for a little bit.
What I'm hearing is that this is really a matter of balance,
Yes.
right? That we don't want to take any rash action that's going to tip the scale the other way. And I'm looking at your graphic up there, and at some point we picked from the carp were eating very aggressively and the plants were down, and then the balance shifted. So my thought about how to approach this is try to regress, estimate how many carp were in the lake at that time, and that might be an optimal number of carp. I'm sure it's well less than 500. And, that maybe we want to think about ramping up to that number because, as you pointed out, the carp die, and so we want to think of replenishment not as let's start this process over again, but try to get to that optimal number.
I agree with you completely.
Very conservative.
The biggest caveat, and I'll stress this until, for every single time you hear me talk about carp, the ramp up cannot be on autopilot. It has to be intentional. You have to be watching it. It can't just be, we're automatically going to stock 50 fish 3 years later. We need to look at the plants each year, see if they're actually increasing. And I would really say increasing, because if they're staying the same, then we could end up in the situation that Oscawana was in, which to most of the residents, the plants were staying the same, but in reality, the grass carp were working. They just were working in a way that nobody actually saw them working in. And then it led to the point where they, tipped the scales there as well. So we need to be really careful about watching them. It can't be something that's on autopilot. But I agree with the general sentiment. If you're going to do carp stocking, the slow ramp up is the better way to go about it.
So when you apply to the DEC for the carp, do you ask for a certain amount of carp, or do they recommend to you how many carp they think that would be appropriate?
It'll be the latter. I think what we would want to do, though, is if we're I think we can recommend the process. So we can give them, so what I would say is if we went to that process, we'd go through the permit, then we'd write them like an extra letter. And in that letter, we would say, all right, our target we think is, I'm gonna make this up, but 400 carp. We believe 400 carp is the right number because of this study and this estimated mortality rate, but this is how we're gonna get here. And we're gonna give them the whole process. And then they might say, yeah, we agree with that whole thinking, we'll give you 400. Or they could say, well, we're not really sure, we're gonna probably slash it. And my guess is that based on all the negative experiences they've had with carp, they're gonna slash it. Even if it might be more of a political decision, but they've just, across the entire state, other regions are just completely not allowing them, just as a blanket. So this is not like a, one region, they are moving away from carp completely. So to get carp in there is gonna be a hurdle.
So that's step one, to see if that's really possible.
Yeah.
Could we, I think it's going to be important to the gentleman's point before that we have some more education on Priscillacor to the public, and maybe a presentation on what effects you've seen, and it seems like you don't have a problem with it, and I get that's fine, but I think hearing chemicals in the lake scares people to
Sure.
death. And I think if we can get some more education and data to show people, you might not satisfy all their concerns because people want to be concerned, but you may at least quell some fears.
It would make sense to have you come sometime when we do the Commission of Lakes meeting that we've been doing, because I'm sure Lake Osceola would want to hear about that too. And, we do have somebody giving a presentation at the next one, which is June 23rd, but maybe over the summer, whatever, works for you, we could look at having a presentation about herbicides.
Yeah, I would be more than happy to do it, and it makes sense because the lakes in the town of Putnam Valley, outside of the peroxide treatments in Lake Peekskill, have not used herbicides before in the lake. So it is a new adventure. So yeah, it makes perfect sense that everyone would be, there would be a lot of hesitation, and rightfully so. There's going to be a lot of education. We've done it before. I'm more than happy to continue to do it. The one thing I would advise though is there has to be a process to make a decision one way or the other, because you're not going to get to 100% of everybody being comfortable with the Priscillacor. And this happens when we deal with herbicide treatments on all the other lakes that we manage. If the group wants to go ahead with it, you're going to sort of have to be comfortable with some people not 100% agreeing with it. It's not the perfect ideal situation, but it is the reality that we run into. And this is with any management, right? If you decide to go with grass carp, there are going to be people who are not going to be happy with stocking the grass carp. But I think the community has to get to a point where you're able to make those decisions with as much, science and reasoning as possible, because you can't be paralyzed by the non-action either way on whatever you decide to choose.
Having that long-term vision, that you can present the plan, this is our long-term plan, and then you have time to get everybody on board for that. And if you get to each step.
Yeah.
So if we go with this plan to get permits for everything, is there fees involved with the DEC to get all those permits even if we never use them? And is your company going to charge us to create those permits?
So the DEC fees are very small. I believe for the pesticide permit, it'll be like $100 to $200. I forget what the current prices are for those. Those fees are small. We can file them if you would like, and we would charge the town for that cost to file those fees.
The charge would be in for the Roaring Brook district.
Yeah. Sorry, because our agreement is sort of with the town, so it's.
It comes out of our pocket.
Yes. There would be a fee for that. Usually the applicators file, so if it's a pesticide treatment, the applicators are the ones who apply for the pesticide and they will do the permits because it's on their insurance to do that. For the grass carp, what would likely happen is I would work with the town to file the permit, so we would give all the supplemental information, we would provide the background, the letter, and how to sort of fill it out, but I think the town itself would have to check all the boxes and go through as surrogates to the.
Well, we're coming up on budget period, on budget
Yeah.
creation.
But you can make the initial reach out to them initially.
Yeah, the initial reach out is, it can just be a part of our existing agreement, that's fine. We can just do that. And that's just an email to them, laying out what we're thinking and going from there.
Sounds like a good place to start. Okay, people are nodding, that's a good thing.
Yeah. I know I spoke about a lot of stuff. Is there any questions about like on-site wastewater, stormwater? I know we spoke a lot about plants here, but it's not the only.
Go in a minute, but is there any negative, the drawdown as a plan, there are negative consequences to drawdowns?
Yeah.
I mean, property values, people live on lakefront, property 6 or 7 months a year, and then are mudfront property during the winter. So there are negative consequences to that.
Yeah.
Are there any negative consequences as far as the ecosystem for the drawdown? Because if that's going to be one of the pillars of our approach, if we're doing herbicides and possibly carp and drawdown, I don't know if the drawdown has been explored as far as the negative implications.
Yeah, so drawdowns definitely have negative implications. The biggest one is that the whole area that gets exposed, everything dies in that area. Maybe if you're a mussel, you can move out of that section, but if you remember back a few years ago before we had plants, many of the areas, especially in the middle of the lake where there's a decent slope, when the drawdown happens, it's just sand. There's nothing there, right? So there is a major impact on all the plants that are there. If the lake ever wanted to establish like emergent vegetation, either cattails or nice reeds that, provide, attenuation of waves and provide habitat for little fish, a drawdown just completely eliminates that possibility. So that is a definite negative impact. There are some other more indirect ones. You take a lot of that organic material, gets focused now into the deeper section of the lake. So there has been some research, and this hasn't been shown in Roaring Brook, but there's some research to show that actually increases like the internal loading and the nutrient cycling because you're concentrating all this organic material down deeper into the lake. There are some, but obviously there are some positives, right? If you're a homeowner and you have struggled with, shallow weeds in your 0 to 3 foot zone, a drawdown is basically a cost-free way to keep your area open. So drawdown definitely has negatives. Yeah, to manage docks. One thing I think that could be good to think about is maybe an alternate year drawdown for the lake, and we have to think about how that matches whatever strategy we choose, but many lakes do like a 2 foot, 2 foot, 5 foot, or they do no drawdown, 5 feet. And the idea is that anybody who needs to get repairs knows, all right, your repair window is now like in 2 years. So what that does though, that keeps those shoreline areas not completely devoid of anything for a longer period of time, and sometimes that's a little bit of a better approach.
It would be nice to have that plan laid out so people can plan.
Yeah, and with that plan, what we want to avoid with the drawdown specifically is we don't want a really deep drawdown and an aggressive treatment and a lot of grass carp in the same year, because that's going to be the recipe to drive things down. Like Squance Pond, which is over by Candlewood, it's on the corner of there, they have a pretty significant drawdown. They do a 7 foot, 7 foot, 11 foot because of First Light's energy, because what they're doing with their pumping. And they had a really low amount of grass carp and they lost everything. So the drawdown's likely going to have to change in terms of how we think about how intense it is over time. And I think it should, because the drawdown's it's not going to all be on the drawdown now to control plants in the shallow areas if you have grass carp again. So naturally the drawdown shouldn't be as intense. The idea is here we have 3 techniques that we can, 2 of them we have great control over in an annual basis, and we can throttle them as we need to. And then that third one is that that background slow build up. So
I would make an ask that you would, based on your professional opinion, put together a plan for maybe a 7-year plan. Whatever you feel is a right number that we can present in an easy way to the public and go from there.
yeah, I can do that.
Okay. All right, good. Thank you.
Thanks, AJ.
Thank you so much.